Sam, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited about this conversation. Can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
So my name's Sam, and I work for Zscaler. I am Global VP and CISO-in-Residence at Zscaler, and I guess I've been in cyber now for, I have to do the math, 32 odd years. Every part of security at some point, Chief Product Officer, CTO. I've run engineering, been a CISO 5 times, and I'm also a fellow at the National Security Institute. I teach cyber. Used to run RSA Labs at MIT, and I teach currently at Wentworth Institute of Technology and Nichols College, and I sit on a few boards as well. So I have too much fun with cyber, basically. And I also make sure to mentor students every
Ooh, that's a good one.
every every 6 months, at least one. Yeah.
I love that. What got you into cyber to begin with?
By accident.
Tell me the accident.
Well, so I did cryptography and cryptanalysis in the early 90s, and I went back to school. And originally I wanted to be a sci-fi author. I wanted to be an astronaut, and I was never going to be that good. So I decided I studied physics and I studied literature. And what do you do with that as a degree, right? So I wound up going back into tech, and I wanted to go into biotech. And I asked a friend of mine because his brother was investing in biotech in the mid 90s. And I said, hey, can you help me connect with your brother and find something? And I thought biotech's the way to go. And he said, well, tell me a bit more about your background, even though I'd known him for a while. His first job out of college was working for my father, who was in tech. He has an amazing career. And about an hour into this short conversation, I realized I was being interviewed. And he hired me for a cyber company. It's 96. Because I'd had some security before that. And as a result, I wound up with patents, ironically, in VPN technology, and was one of the co-inventors of the personal firewall. We sold to McAfee, but what really got me stuck in it was I went from doing documentation and then QA and getting into engineering. And eventually, when we got bought by McAfee, I did product management. But it was that we were actually helping people. We had a mom who called us up and was trying to buy a personal firewall, and I couldn't understand why something so technical that we had written really for companies to be able to put a barrier at the front of their PCs. And we were talking, by that point, 97, 98. Why was she buying this for home use? And it turned out she had differently abled son. I think that's the correct term for it. And websites were being used to help with education. And hackers were targeting those websites because the victims didn't understand what was happening to them. And these parents had gotten together and were purchasing a $75 at the time. This is 97, 98, personal firewalls. And I was so disgusted that I think that's when I said, okay, it's going to get worse. And that's where I sort of found my mission. And then I went to McAfee and Computer Associates and RSA and so on. And then eventually Zscaler.
Nice. You said you worked in security before 96. Was there really much security before 96?
Yeah, there sure was. We just didn't call it cyber. We didn't even necessarily call it infosec, but there were certainly security principles. We absolutely had CIA. There were some really good secure protocols. IPX, SPX was pretty good, actually. If you remember that was Novell. But we had security principles that was extended from physical principles.
Yeah.
And I did cryptanalysis in SIGINT at the time. So it went from signals. I've always loved puzzles. I've always loved riddles. In the early days, in my personal early days, I did linguistics. I've always loved languages. I speak several languages, but I did classical Greek and Latin, and I always loved puzzling through these things. And so it was a natural extension to try to break codes and do that sort of thing. And one of the most useful tools was using computer science to do so. It just made sense. It's applied mathematics, really, and for a purpose. And so then there's the question of, well, how do you break it and how do you prevent it? And that absolutely has existed for a very long time, arguably since the 50s as its own discipline. I mean, we even had, everyone knows about, Captain Crunch Whistle and whatnot, but even my dad was saying in the 60s and 70s with time sharing and some of the old, even prior to what we would think of as mainframe, the fights they used to have over single sign-on on some of these shared computing systems. And he used to give, long before there was a computer science class, he'd say, if you can hack the system and break the core, this, pre-ACF2 RACF top secret days. He said, if you can break that and actually get access as much as you want, I'll give you an A in the course. And that was his standing challenge to every class. And then part of it was because he hated the IBM systems they were given. Sorry, IBM, this is a long time ago. But because he wanted to buy a DEC machine back then. And of course, he could then go to the dean and say, see, I told you should have got the other machine, which was very smart, right?
So have you preferred the trying to break things or trying to prevent things from being broken?
Well, it's funny you say that because I'm sitting here with a
passionate and fun.
flipper. Like I have a flipper, like and I'm charging it at the moment. But
I actually just finally got around and got mine about a month ago.
I usually have by my computer. I don't have it right now. I usually have lock picks because what I found was I've always been able to pick locks, but it was a struggle. And what I found was I was on Zooms and I'd get very bored. Not that this is boring, but I mean, like during COVID, you just get right. And so what happened was I would below the screen be looking at people and talking, and where before I would think that the picks were very small and the lock was very small, and I've got big hands, right? And so I was like fumbling, and it was like transparent locks because I was trying to improve my skills. When I dropped it down in my head, the dimensions changed, and I realized the bandwidth you're capable of through your nervous system is much greater than what you can perceive. And so the locks became much bigger in my head. And I'm sitting there and I went click, and the next one went click, and then click. And I was like, wow, I got out of the visual. And that was a huge lesson for me because it was like a leveling up, and it's a great analogy for a lot of what we do. Now, to answer your question, I feel a mission and a need to protect people. It's a very personal thing. I'm fascinated and intrigued with the attacker mindset, and I've always had it. But my brother once told me, he said it was no shock I wound up in an industry where I protect people, and that I have done so consistently. So I think I get more satisfaction, and I have a mission of trying to make sure that people are not really hurt in at any scale.
I like that. And in that thought process, clearly we always talk about it before I hit record button. Have you ever been a victim of a scam, a fraud, or a cybersecurity incident?
Several times, actually. And I know I said this really quickly to you when you asked me this, and was I comfortable talking about it? I'm always willing to talk about it. By the way, I have a lot of failures, but I don't think those are failures. Nobody's a failure for being put in the crosshairs.
Yeah.
So obviously I was first I ran product, and I was CTO at RSA during RSA's breach, which is now 13 years ago, and that's been written about quite extensively. That was miserable. I mean, we didn't just have one attacker, we had two attackers, one of whom was attacking the other one, both from the same nation state. It was absolutely savage. But I personally been attacked. I mean, I've been spearphished, I suppose whaled, which isn't a great thing to feel, but my wife was attacked too. I remember we were sitting in bed about, we went to bed late. We had young children at the time, and just settling down, she got a call that she thought was from her bank, and very, very well done. We're not talking sloppy. This would have been 9 years ago, and it was specifically going after her with the correct research. And she looked at me and said, that didn't feel right. And she turned and said, I said, okay. I said, what do you mean? She said, I think that was fraud. And so she immediately called the bank and canceled that they had already in that time done something. Now, this was 9 years ago, right? So this was almost automated, and very well done, even with the human machine interface even then. And look, I ran a product set that stopped and helped to mitigate loss to fraud for banking and card not present transactions for 500 million people. So it doesn't matter how smart you are or how well versed in security, you can still be the target, still fall to it. The numbers may be lower, but that's not the only time either. It's happened to me several times. In fact, I've been personally targeted with everything from we've got pictures of you scandal to we've got your credit card, click here, and of course you haven't updated your Netflix hits. But I'm really good at not clicking on anything now, anything. And so legit emails. In fact, I think my own security department hates the fact that I even take things from home and forward it just in case. But it's so bad when marketing departments mess up and send you things crafted like they're phishing.
Yes.
I mean, could you just, we went through all this trouble to train people across, business world and say, here's what phishing looks like. And then the marketing department in some company goes and uses those same practices. They don't use their logo correctly, or they go and use somebody else's URL. It's like, why did you do that?
I know someone who got in trouble at his company because he got something, it was an internal company document or process or whatever, and it looked fishy to him. So he just deleted it, thinking, hey, I've done the right thing. And then,
Yeah.
2 weeks later, it's, hey, that project, we need it. He's, what are you talking about? Oh, we emailed that to you 2 weeks ago. And we said, da da da. He's like, oh, I thought that was a phishing attempt. So I just deleted it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's got to feel. So that's also you can't just lob it over the wall and be like, well, action items on his plate now.
Yeah.
That's kind of bad culture. Um, I hope that didn't stick to him, by the way.
No, it was kind of one of those everyone's
It should be a
annoying
project manager going, did you receive it? Like,
annoying at the moment, but ultimately it's like, yeah, look, we look back at it. Yeah, it did seem a little bit. Yeah, we see how you could have thought that. So it was, no harm, no foul, but still an uncomfortable experience to be had, probably on both sides.
absolutely. Yeah.
So with your wife getting the phone call from the bank, because that was 10 years ago, is pretty early on in good spear, like in terms of like good spear phishing, seems to
It's
be
funny,
pretty
there's a
pretty
recent
early.
there, but there is a recency bias. I remember in 2003 talking about phishing. I remember in 2008 I was talking about spyware, but there's always this habit saying, "Well, it's just happened. It's
Yeah.
just happened." At the time, no. I mean, we used the term spear phishing as well. Now, compared to today's levels, that felt primitive. But
Yeah.
back then, have you ever heard of the Shepherd tone, by the way?
No.
People can Google this and take a look at it. The Shepherd tone is an audio illusion that makes it sound. And some people can warning, some people can feel kind of sick from it. It's like one of those old Star Trek episodes where somebody's like, screaming as a thing turning on the wall,
Yeah.
a torture device. But no, what it does is it sounds like it's always increasing in frequency. Of course, it isn't. But the way that it loops, your ear thinks it's continually going up and can really cause
Oh,
you quite a bit of anxiety.
interesting.
I love listening to it because it's like, okay, after a while you can hear how it's looping, but it's that sense of it's always worse than it was before. And it can't always be worse than it was before. That would be a bubble,
Yeah.
right? So, but to some degree, it is much worse than it used to be. But even then, we felt like it was heavy at the time. And let's face it, we had, if you go back and look at the size of breaches back in 2010 to 2015 time range, we had big breaches happening, right? That's when the Target breach happened.
Yeah.
That's when Equifax happened. That's when Sony happened, right? They weren't recent, and there were phishing components in some of those as well.
It's interesting that you're talking about that you mentioned the recency bias on that, because I started thinking when you said that, I'm like, oh, maybe it's just we feel like things are getting worse.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe they are. Maybe we feel they are, and maybe they are in localized ways. It's like the second law of thermodynamics, right? That things tend towards a more entropic state, right? But it's not true locally. That's how you can get an increase of information in one area. That's how you can get life created effectively. Otherwise, everything would just go to the cold energy death of the universe in a sprint, right?
Yeah.
Uh, this is true. It can be getting worse locally. I'll tell you, it's a lot worse in the Ukraine right now than it
Yeah.
was 5 years ago, right? So it can get worse, but overall, um, things are generally roughly the same. The absolute numbers are absolutely going up, but compared to GDP, I don't know. I haven't done that number. I mean, I've heard ridiculous numbers of tens of trillions. I mean, I've heard numbers that make it seem like it's, 3 or 4 times the Canadian GNP. Don't know if that's true. But I think it's worth comparing dollars to dollars
Yeah.
and comparing it to GNP. I know, for instance, that usually most reports are the ratios are correct year over year, um, even if the absolute numbers are wrong. So usually, if the FBI report that comes out every year says, "Hey, ransomware is up 30%," it's usually correct, even if it's a poor instrumentation of ransomware in both years.
Yeah. Is there
No slam
any?
on the FBI, by the way. It's a lot of people don't self-report, and it's a consistent rate and all the rest, right?
Yeah. I mean, I talk about scams, and inevitably after an episode, I'll get emails, and talk to people who have uh, I can't I think it was Debbie Johnson. She lost like $1 million to a romance scam.
That's
And
terrible.
every time she gets up on stage and talks about it, even years later, she's like, I feel
It's right
like
back in it.
emotionally it's dealing with all that again, but then it's just constant droves of people saying, yeah, it happened to me too, and I was too ashamed to report it. So whatever numbers that we have on these things, whether they're ransomware, whether they're romance scams, crypto scams, rug pulls, it they're
It's
way
tragic.
they're way underreported, and the we probably don't even begin to see the tip of the iceberg of the tragedy in people's lives.
Completely right. Completely right.
So, like, and now I entirely forget what we planned on talking about because
Uh,
we've jumped off this deep end of
well,
tragedy here.
there is change, and sometimes change is disruptive. I
Yeah,
mean, sometimes when a change hits, it truly is different. And people will talk about a singularity. That's come up a few times. I think Werner
yeah,
Vinge was one of the ones who said it first. He was a sci-fi writer, but there others have too. I think von Neumann did too. Um, Werner said it would happen because of robotics, genetics, robotics, information technology, and nanotechnology. When those sort of asymptotically approached vertical, that we wouldn't know what we would look like afterwards. But we don't have to have anything quite so dramatic to have massive disruptive change in how we do things. I mean, simply the internal combustion engine was one of those moments,
yeah.
right?
But we look back at it historically and we say, oh well, we see what came out of the other side of this, and so therefore it was a good thing, or it was a productive thing, or maybe it was a good thing. I don't, we have a little bit of a
Cory
bias.
Doctorow, Cory Doctorow, who's a Canadian sci-fi writer, actually said recently there's a bubble effect going on around AI,
Yeah,
and he said, but that's not a bad thing. He said anything interesting has a bubble effect. I'm paraphrasing him. Um, the question is there value left around afterwards? And so the dot-com era did, when the bubble burst, it did leave value.
yeah,
And when the telecom bubble burst, it left infrastructure around. When Enron's bubble burst, it did not,
yeah,
right? Or, there's other companies in particular, when there's a lot of fraud involved and no value created, those are the bubbles that are horrible, right? But there's always a bubble effect when something interesting is happening because capital rushes to it.
yeah,
And so what I can say is that that's one of the things you see when there's a truly disruptive technology, right? That it actually changes how we invest and what we invest in many, many ways, both as investors and within our businesses when we choose to build things like R&D. Now, having said that, so I guess what we've got is they're not quite black swans, but what we've got is incremental changes. Is it really that different? It can go quite far in
yeah,
some cases, and sometimes it's just like the shepherd tone. And then you've got the really disruptive things. And I think what we've got and is now the potential for truly disruptive things. And what happens in that world is security has to catch up and privacy has to catch up. It can be very, very difficult.
yeah. Do you see that as a particular challenge, the getting security to keep up?
Well, yeah. Look, one of the things that we do is we tend to create, well, there's a few problems. I used to call one the investor paradox. It is that in peacetime, we tend to create single points of failure. So what does your CFO want to do? Well, they want cheaper things and they want less suppliers. They have a let's move to less strategic providers who
Yeah,
can give us more stuff. What do you do in wartime? Well, if you really look at like the Second World War or the First World War, any significant ability for your opponent to damage your logistics and supply chain, you build redundancy. You go to lots of sources so that
yeah,
if anybody takes out your fuel depot, you have other fuel depots. And so that wartime tends to change some things. So one thing is the investor paradox. In peacetime, we build infrastructure that's not very resilient. That's interesting. So we have to remember, especially in peacetime, to build resilience and to be anti-fragile.
hmm,
This is a difficult thing to do because it puts security at odds with IT. It says, hey, we need to really think about, disaster recovery and business continuity, and we need two of everything at least. and we need to test this stuff. And sorry, we have to do the disaster scenarios while everyone's going, no, we're trying to really get efficient in our P&L.
Yeah.
Like, could you please just back off? And that's just one problem. The biggest problem is still alignment with the business for most of us, right? Because, but people haven't realized that we really, when done correctly, you can embrace new change. But the other thing is that there's this incrementalism in the pursuit in a first order chaos world where the enemy is really nature, in the pursuit of a better infrastructure with closer to five nines, which is what IT does. You get the little better, little better, little better. It also means you never go back and tear out to the studs and re-architect.
Yeah.
So you never, so what do we get? Well, I said in 96, I filed my first VPN patent. We're still using VPNs.
Yeah.
Like, why are we still connecting networks to networks and struggling with micro segmentation? We do, right? When in fact, it's fully capable to move up the stack, turn the network into a commodity, and do segmentation as logical segmentation, app targets and so on, and user groups, and be able to do this as a software defined provisioning and authorization. We don't, because we're still saying, oh, let's not do away with the investment of 25 plus
Yeah.
years, nearly 30 years. Let's not do away with that. But in wartime, or when a disruptor comes along, you go, wait a minute, I have to deal with this topography, this attack surface. And so one of the things I would suggest is that zero trust is in fact a strategy and an architecture for minimizing functionality, right? Least function and least privilege in an infrastructure, such that you have the most flexibility, adaptability, and ability to service and provide high quality to the business. So you can support complexity without being complicated. But that requires going back and saying, okay, that thing we just spent 26 years building, 27 years, maybe we should think about doing it differently. And that people get very scared at that. IT has become custodians of infrastructure rather than brokers, which is where they should be, where they want to be when you really ask them. Do you want to be keeping the lights on, or do you want to be working at app provisioning? They know what
Yeah.
they want to do, but that's a big jump, right? That's a move your cheese moment.
And it's a hard decision to make. I mean, I think, for those who've been around computers a while, when Apple, oh gosh, let's see if I can get this story right. When they went from OS 8 to OS 9, I think, or maybe it was 9 to 10, they basically said backwards compatibility, we're throwing it all out and we're starting from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
That's a risky, that's a risky move to make.
It is, and I remember having products. I had this with a SIM product back in 2009 when I was at RSA. We had this product called Envision. I had this same product with an access control product at CA, same problem. If you don't provide an easier upgrade path and movement path, it becomes a do I even want you moment
Yes.
for the customer. And that's fair. It takes courage to do that. It takes leadership to do that. But you've got to be customer centric when you do it. You don't have to roll over and do everything that the customer asks. They will come with you in a vision if you articulate it right. That's just my experience.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're actually in the cloud age, and truly deeply in it. The turnaround with agile development is so much quicker now than it was back in those shipping boxes days, that you can be closer to the need. You can observe in close to real time, real use, and see that. And these companies have changed things like pricing, and they've changed things like delivery mechanism. They've gone from products to services, and they kept their customer base. This is now known how to do it. Of course, some people insist on relearning it all the time, and it can be quite painful. But I think if you take the zero trust principle to heart, you actually become far less vulnerable. What do I mean by that? So I have an analogy that I told you I was going to bring up, but I haven't told you the analogy yet, which is Go, the game of Go.
Mm-hmm.
And so when AI was first playing Go, DeepMind did this. It was playing some interesting games of Go, but DeepMind gave 59 new openings for the game of Go. Now the grandmasters, because it works like a martial art of the game, looked at these openings and said things. There's an article in the Atlantic on it. Said it was like watching an alien play, and it was like a gift from the far future and how to play the game that they were masters at, eighth, ninth Dan type of masters. And the openings, they couldn't fathom why the stones were placed on any of the 361 intersections the way they were. And when you're that good at Go, you don't, you have to, it's a territorial game. You lose by a few intersections. But they were getting trounced, like absolutely trounced, because they weren't, first of all, AI didn't learn or develop the game as a form of narrative, which is how the human mind works.
Yeah.
And it was finding entirely new vectors of attack. Okay, so let's go back to the security world. In the security world, that translates into vulnerabilities will be found in places we never expected. In Go, there's something called joseki, which is when somebody makes an opening, what is the optimal response to it? There were no joseki for these movements. The equivalent for us is there's no ability to patch that. There's no, it's funny, Heartbleed still, there's still Heartbleed out there, right?
Yeah.
Some of those things are never patchable. You have to find a way to get in the way of it. This will be like that. So if you don't have a zero trust approach where you say, if I don't need the listener, it shouldn't be out there. If I don't need to be provisioning and putting somebody onto a network, I shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do I get least privileged, least function accessibility? Right. If I don't have to, if I've got a coffee pot, why does it have an FTP server on it? Like, come on, because the COTS OS had it? That's ridiculous. So this is at the heart of it, the way that we beat the AIs coming, or at least get more resistant to them ahead of time. And by the way, to other disruptors, because there's others than just AI, is by minimizing the number of open intersections they can choose from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Change the rules of the game effectively. And by the way, I say others because we're in a track of AI development. There's more things coming. Some of them will be more disruptive, things like agentic and AGI and so on. But there's other tracks of disruptors too, right? There's synthetic biology, there's robotics, there's nanotechnology. We've got drones. I mean, there's quantum. So there's a lot of other things. If they happen at the same time, you don't want to be rethinking a classic architecture that's 26 years old and trying to figure out how do I change all my libraries out because I'm no longer effectively encrypting anything. That's an exaggeration. You're not sure if you can prove that you are or what might be stolen. And you're also having to deal with an entirely new form of AI that is just whistling through the vulnerabilities you never expected. Could you imagine doing that? But I'm not interested in FUD. The way to get ahead of it, quite constructively, is to take these principles, and it's not a binary, 0 or 1 game. You can start to get less trust in an environment that has immediate benefits from security risk perspective. And you can approach simplification of IT, which saves money, makes it a better user experience, and frankly, easier to support if you do it right.
Nice. You were talking earlier about lock picks. And it maybe I was just thinking now when we were talking about other vulnerabilities. I was having a conversation with somebody about they bought a new lock for their door and they were really proud that like, oh, this lock was, you know, it's going to take a thief like a half an hour or 45 minutes. Like, yeah, you could pick it, but it's going to take you 45 minutes. So therefore no one's ever going to get in my house.
Brick
And
in
I
the
looked at
window.
and I looked down and there's a rock on the ground and I say, you've got a window right there.
Yeah,
I,
exactly.
sure, you've got a lock that's going to take me 45 minutes to pick it, but I could throw that rock through that window in 2 seconds. And
I would have been impressed if
that,
he
that,
if he'd somehow like wired an electric current to the rock and
that
zapped the person who picked it up like that. I'd be like, come on, dude. Now that was
then he's
I
actually
bet you,
thought about it.
well, probably because you suggested it, right? Like, how do you booby trap the path of least resistance, right? That's a deception practice.
But again, like it comes down to that, like we're talking about biases that we get biased and thinking I have to protect my door because that's where I come and go from.
Mm,
Therefore, that's what I have to
but
protect,
that's
as
not actually
opposed
the
to
problem. Hmm.
the problem is that I could pop up your window in faster than anyone can pick a lock. I don't need to pick the lock. There's another option.
Yeah, I mean the problem has to be defined right. This is a fundamental thing I learned actually when I was at Arbor Networks and we were part of Danaher at the time. They had this amazing system for problem definition. In business, they used to say a problem is defined as a target, a miss, and a trend. And then you go find the root cause by going to the actual data around it.
Yeah.
This was so useful because the problem for your house is not how do I make the door stronger? It's how do I prevent people from getting in? That's the problem. So as soon as you start fixating on a path of least resistance, you're squeezing the balloon, it's going somewhere else. I'm mixing metaphors, sorry about that. But like, you're not defining the problem correctly. You're getting distracted with the beauty of a solution.
Yeah.
And the same thing can happen in business, and it can certainly happen in security.
Have you found that was a common practice in security of like, we're so
Still is.
focused on preventing X, Y, or Z
Oh
that
yeah,
we totally
this is the
for
main problem with GRC. So GRC is wonderful. It catalyzes behavior, right? We get some regulation. It says you now have to be paid attention to. Congratulations. And then the problem is now not defined correctly, right? I'll give you an example. Why do we say that you need to log 6 failed logins?
because you want to detect a pattern going
For
something
brute force. But
yeah.
bad guys don't do that now
Yeah.
unless they're trying to distract you or fill up your logs. They don't. They turn up and they get the password right. The last thing they want to do is get it wrong. They don't
Yeah.
brute force the door anymore because everybody has that rule. Now, arguably, if you didn't have that rule, maybe they wouldn't do it. But techniques have evolved to the point where that rule is useless and it's filling up logs. You know what that rule does? It actually tells you who's struggling in your user base.
Yeah.
Right? And we have countless examples of that. The actual things that you care about from a finding bad guys and improving, incident response perspective is not the same as the things you're required to collect. As an example, I realize somebody right now is chewing on their keyboard listening to this, but I imagine a few other people are nodding as well. I have a good friend, Josh Corman, who says HIPAA. He challenges them to say, why do you still need it? That's bold, right?
Yeah.
I hope I didn't just call him out on that, but I have a tremendous respect for him saying that. He said it publicly on a podcast, so it's okay. Yeah, you got to define the problem correctly, and then you got to keep you not only your eye on the problem, you got to keep making sure you're still defining it correctly. Because the thing about human biases is you're still human. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you can still get hacked. None of us are immune. I know some really brilliant people who've written like incredible insight on hacking techniques and hacking research who get hacked, and there's no shame in it. And the fact is, one of the techniques the bad guys use is, in fact, trying to keep the shame from keeping us from sharing it. So to hell with that. I'll always share it, even if it's mortally embarrassing. And I know my peers will be like, "No, dude, we got you back," because otherwise, this wouldn't be our industry.
Oh, I it always comes back to like we have to figure out how to think differently. Not that I'm trying to promote an Apple slogan here.
No, no, no. They don't have they may have that as a marketing slogan, but they don't have a monopoly on the idea. It's you you I think it's really important, and you and I have spoken about this. It's really important that in any population you have those who think differently.
Yeah.
We need the rebel mindset. We need the rebel archetype. Hackers are an important part of the human species. We were talking about psychopaths, actually.
Yeah.
Because in every population, there's a I'm not a psychologist. I don't do clinical psychology, but from what I understand, and feel free to comment or whatever, if anybody is a clinical psychologist, from what I understand, there's a fairly consistent rate of sociopathy and psychopathy in most populations, which means it serves a purpose or did at some point in human demographics and populations. And the same is true of other supposed aberrant or statistically, marginal groups. They're part of human society, and they're important for our health as a species and our resilience. Same is true of hackers. It's a mindset. We need it to make sure, that person who's always annoying and testing the boundaries. Well, they're the ones that made sure that your hut wasn't going to collapse by testing it to see if it would collapse on a few of them, right? Like I'm imagining prehistoric times, so we're out of science and into my opinion, but there you go. I believe that hacking is a mindset that's important to us as a species.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely prior to computers or people who have computers, forgive with it. There's always people that just have a mindset for trying to break things. Not there's a difference between
Insurance people did that. Our
Difference between
intelligence
malicious
systems.
and not malicious. Let's take the malicious versus not
Yeah,
malicious
so
out of it.
hacking mindset's one thing.
Yeah,
Hacking ethics and what you do with it is another.
yeah,
But our own intelligence capability as Western nations certainly came out of the insurance industry because people had actuarial data and they knew exactly what was insured and they had
yeah.
thought about weaknesses and then they could tell the airplanes where to send bombs.
Yeah, that mindset of how do I break stuff? How do I poke at stuff? What happens when I do the unexpected? Great for like a great personality for someone who's doing QA. Let me do all the things that people just don't do. Let me just not follow the rules.
And the funny thing is, it I think we make it really hard for the younger generations coming in because we speak a different language and we have acronyms everywhere and they emerged slowly and arbitrarily. The actual ideas and concepts are very accessible. I would implore anyone who's listening to this, and this is one of the reasons that I mentor students. I would implore you, make it easier to understand. If you can't make something easy to understand, you don't know it well enough. So when I hear somebody pontificate with, 50-cent words in long sentences, and they're effectively gatekeeping from another generation, I'm not impressed. But if someone can take something like here's a zero trust, what is it? Well, it's making sure that that only the things that are needed to be accessed can be accessed for as long as they're needed. It's a very simple definition with some big implications. Let's go look at them.
That's
I
probably
think
about the
anyone
best
would.
definition I've heard.
Oh, thank you. But like, see, I work at making it simpler, right? Not too simple. And I
Mhm.
look for analogies because then you can start to get them in the right mindset to go into the details. If you just throw 50-cent words at people and two sentences for a textbook, you're just trying to impress your peers. So I'd implore anyone listening is make it easier because we shouldn't be gatekeeping.
I like it.
That's the effect, even if it's not your goal. Just like solve the right problem.
So as we wrap up here, for anyone who's wanting to get into cybersecurity, what pathway recommendations do you have for them?
So my biggest advice is so I realize this is really hard for some people that look at me and they see a white male, right? For some people, it's especially difficult, but for everyone, we need you. And you should you should never be ready for the next job. You should be just this side of ready. You should be tackling something that's a little too big and a little bit scary. And the biggest thing you can do is find allies and find a network. I put this out there and it's amazing. I never get overwhelmed. I always say, contact me. If you want to get in, I will beat up the terrible sales pitch. But if somebody, I know three things about a salesperson, by the way. I know that they don't know me. I know that they don't, that they think my product is necessary and they just want to give me a PowerPoint if they can trap me. If a salesperson breaks that mold and comes to me legitimately to make a human connection, I will always listen. But if anyone ever comes to me and says, I want to get into cyber, help me, I will do anything for them. Anything. And I know that's true of just about everyone I know who's a peer, except for a few people that I don't really like and they know it. So like honestly, I think this space it has got so much room for innovation and different ways of thinking. So don't wait to be ready. Don't think you need to go the formal path of a certification, for instance. Do it by all means, but don't wait to start and work on making friends and allies because we want you.
I love it. And so, perfect segue. If people want to get a hold of you, how can they find you?
LinkedIn's probably the easiest. If you if you want to send me email, it's pretty obvious. It's just scurry at zscaler.com, my first letter and last name. I hey, if people start spamming me, then I'll take care of that. But that would be easy enough to do anyway.
Yes,
So the best way is probably LinkedIn. Just send me a message and connect with me. Um, it is not a community of trust, which means I will accept invites. But if people then prove to me that they're just doing it for malicious reasons, they will be blocked with prejudice. But if someone says, I just want to get to know you, or hey, can you give me some advice for my career? Boom, I will answer you. It's coming.
I love that. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to hearing it.
Thank you.